Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
So I want to get started talking about COP26. I think it's probably the biggest attention this conference has yet received over the years. And people have been, I think, nervously and optimistically looking at what comes out of it. I'm not sure a lot of us even sort of understood what, if anything, came out of the conference. So I actually wanted to start with that question for each of you, which is that with this urgency and gravity of the climate and ecological crisis today, what are your impressions about COP26 and meetings like it? Are its outcomes going to influence your work in promoting positive change and a more sustainable future? And I think especially, do you feel at all optimistic about the future? So maybe you'll start with Vandana, talking a little bit about that.
It's hello, Scott, and hello, David and Stephan. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this very important dialogue. Now, going back to 1992 at the Earth Summit, in a way, the inspiration for the legally binding UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, really came from the kind of thinking we are engaged in today. But along the way, those who had spent 2 centuries of extractive fossil fuel industrialism, and before that, colonialism, they've been, colonialism is a very clever training ground on how to declare your wars as civilizing missions. And I have seen over the years the degradation of the UN system and the content of the UN COPs. So why are we having 26 COPs for a climate emergency? Surely that's the emergency. Yeah. So if you think of it, the first few years were lost because it was so clear that most of the pollution had been caused by the industrial countries. So the binding treaties were for them. They were called the Annex 1. And they managed to not just get out of the pollution being stopped, they actually turned pollution into the new market. And the entire Kyoto Protocol was an emissions trading protocol. The emissions kept going up, the profits kept going up, and the Kyoto period ended without solving the problem it was supposed to address. Most people did not notice, because media spin is a very important part of how the public perceives one of these events. Most of the people think of Copenhagen as a big success, but Copenhagen is where the legally binding agreement was killed by President Obama, who is celebrated all over the world as the big climate warrior. He took the 5 polluters and said, why do we have legal binding agreements? Let's just do voluntary commitments and carry on with business as usual, make lots of money in the process. So Paris actually was not under the legally binding framework, it was voluntary commitments. And the voluntary commitments get very nice in language and more empty in content. So focus on the COP26. Now, I have always connected the earth and climate change. For me, the earth is living. I've always connected biodiversity and the biosphere to the earth's self-regulating capacity for giving us the climate in which our species has survived. And I see climate change as the pollution and disruption and the metabolic disorder that's disrupted that system. So that's why I wrote Soil Not Oil, yeah? My book, I wrote this for the lead up to Copenhagen, 2009. And I could make out that the way we produce our food and ship it around and process it and destroy the Amazon for GM soya and destroy the Indonesian rainforest for palm oil, we are contributing to about 45 to 50% of the emissions to create bad food that's making everyone sick, including the pandemics and the infectious diseases. well, agriculture just disappeared. Two amazing, deliberate removals. Fossil fuels is fossil fuels. It's what the Earth's fossilized over 600 million years. She turns some of it into oil, some of it into coal, some of it into gas. All three are problematic for climate. All three emit fossil fuel emissions. Interestingly, oil and gas were removed because these are rich country fuels. But I think they were also removed because the protests in rich countries of climate activists in Canada, in the United States, are against oil and gas pipeline. Now, if the activists had managed to get a UN commitment, they'd have been so much stronger. So to crush those movements, and to allow oil and gas to continue to expand, oil and gas were removed. And India was objecting and said, no, you can't have a selection of fossil fuels. You must mention all of them. And our minister is on record in India for his press releases, say, we were told we will keep oil and gas out if you read out this phase out of coal to phase down of coal. So India was trapped and the media was ready next day. India failed the COP. No, the big polluters failed the COP. They are still the big polluters. Yeah, all of the new research being done on who's actually polluting, 1% is responsible for most. The rich countries, if you take their legally, the Paris commitment, they're responsible still for 94% excess emissions beyond what they should be doing. The second big emission, when I did Soil Not Oil, I did a lot of study on industrial globalized agriculture. And nitrogen fertilizers, I've been doing agriculture work since 84 when Punjab erupted in violence. And, just today, our farmers who protested for 14 months have won on all their demands. And they are leaving. They had totally put up camps all over Delhi. And since 84, when the first protest started in Punjab, I studied agriculture. And I realized nitrogen fertilizer is a big piece of the problem. It's the same process from fossil fuels that make explosives and ammunition for Hitler, also makes fertilizer. And nitrous oxide is 300 times more damaging for climate change. Nitrous oxide disappears from the discussion. But now, after all these years, I realized in Rio, it didn't matter because the corporations weren't organized. Yeah? The Earth Summit was people and their governments. Now, the real activity is behind the scene. And you must have seen all the news items of there were more private jets at this COP than ever before. It's the side declarations and the side agreements that matter. And also this lovely new phrase of net zero, which says we'll keep polluting, but now we find offsets in your forests and your agriculture. So we call this carbon colonization. And this is what the countries, like-minded countries of the poor world said. This is carbon colonization. So am I more hopeful? Well, I'm so used to hijacks now. I've done this work for half a century and I don't get surprised. And all it does is just deepen your commitment to stand with Gaia, to take guidance from her and continue to grow. And the fact that the situation is worse in terms of climate havoc, and it is worse in terms of the polluters playing new tricks on the people, it just means we have to do the more truthful work with deeper commitment. So I'm more optimistic than ever before.
Stephan, how would you like to talk about this question of COP26 and optimism?
Well, I think what was missing was deep ecology, as Vandana was saying. I think everything Vandana was saying at the core is about deep ecology. So, it's this sense of really deep feeling that the earth, we're born from the earth, that we're beings of the earth, that our molecules have come from the earth, that they will go back to the earth when we die. And that, if everybody in the COP had that feeling just as a natural birthright from childhood, cultivated from childhood, never let go of through all the time of adolescence and education, Everybody had that feeling, just like you know who your mother is. Most of us know we have a mother, we have a father, we have a family. That sort of feeling, I would call that a sort of deep ecology feeling towards Gaia. Sense of deep relationship, deep connection. Then we wouldn't have had there wouldn't have been any need for COPs anyway, because we wouldn't have got ourselves into this situation. But I didn't see any of that, apart from, of course, with the events outside with the protests, but with the actual people doing the discussions with the governments and with all the business people. I mean, it was really not deep ecology at all. I just didn't feel it there at all. And that makes me feel very sad, because it means that psychologically, inwardly, we're still very far from discovering what we need to discover in order to really solve the crisis. And that leads to all the aberrations that Vandana has just so brilliantly outlined, you know, all that strange behaviors and strange evasions and lies and cheating and whatnot. So in one sense, I'm pessimistic, because to have a change, psychological change of such a magnitude, both personally and throughout society, throughout humanity, in such a short period of time, is quite a challenge. But on the other hand, you know, all it takes is to step into a forest for a few minutes and just listen to the bird song. If you can just manage to do that, or just look at the shape of a tree, or look at the way the vines move up the trunk of a tree, or the way clouds move across the sky, anyone can feel that in an instant. So that gives me hope. But how can we encourage people to feel these deep ecological experiences and have them and be nurtured by them on a massive scale? I think that's part of the challenge that I've been working on for a long time.
David, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate what Vandana and Stephan have said here. They certainly express, you know, better than I could why, frankly, I wasn't all that excited about COP26, and why I really didn't follow it very closely, because my expectations were quite low. And you know, after a while, you get tired of watching national leaders sort of try to kick the can or the bucket down the road, even when they commit themselves to something. They know it's something that they themselves won't have to be responsible for when that time comes around. So in a certain way, COP is a little hard to take seriously, in the sense that if it does have some importance, it's more an expression of where we're at, rather than making new commitments, which frankly I'm not very certain are going to be fulfilled in a meaningful way. Following on from what Stephan had to say, the other thing that I always find myself having to emphasize in this situation is that, you know, COP26, and to a large extent our attention is focused on climate and reducing carbon emissions, but we also just have to keep in mind that that's really just the tip of the ecological iceberg. That climate emergency though it is, it's really just part of a much larger ecological crisis that includes so many other things, such as, obviously, you know, biodiversity loss. I mean, incredible amounts of pollutants in the air, in the water, in the soil, in our bodies. You know, we can go on, and you can sort of add your favorite issue to that, and what that points to, of course, is what Stephan was referring to, that it's not just a matter of our civilization at this point reducing carbon emissions, or maybe we individually reducing our carbon footprint, which, you know, okay, there's some virtue to that, but it really does seem to come back to this larger question about the relationship humanity as a whole has with the earth. And I think it's pretty clear to everyone listening to this that we have a significant problem. I mean, I think it's quite ironic that just when we have achieved a truly global civilization, that civilization seems to be self-destructing. And, you know, we really have to ask why and try to get at the roots of that, rather than just sort of addressing the most extreme symptoms, which really are just symptoms of a much deeper and a much greater problem. In regard to the question of optimism, pessimism, you know, for a Buddhist, they are a kind of a semantic pair, a dualistic concept. It's like optimism, pessimism. I'm reminded that my favorite definition of a pessimist is someone who has had to live with an optimist. I mean, it's interesting how they can sort of reinforce each other, and you can sort of flip from one to the other. And I think that really misses the point in terms of the kind of commitment that is necessary today, right? It's like optimism can be, yeah, things are going to be okay. Pessimism is, nah, what can we do? But I think as a mindset, that in itself can be problematical. You can also express that in terms of like hope and fear or hope and despair. Joanna Macy has made the point that, Buddhist languages, I don't know which one she had in mind, they don't have a word for hope, that would be considered a kind of a distraction from what needs to be done. So I realize this is a kind of an odd way of looking at it, but when I think about my own engagement and what needs to be done, it's not a matter of optimism, pessimism, hope, despair. I don't know what's going to happen. I do not know what's the best way to go about trying, et cetera, et cetera. There is a kind of fundamental don't know mind built into certainly Zen, but when we talk about it. So in a way, the danger is that those dualistic ways of thinking can distract us from the urgency of, doing the very best we can without knowing whether anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever.
I wouldn't mind doubling down on that question of, the full question of human civilization, because, we're really only just realizing the impact that human civilization has on the biosphere. And there's plenty of people who wonder whether it's even possible at all for human civilization to prosper without harming the earth. So I'd like to ask each of you that question, and also, is our current civilization any different from prior ones in its relationship to nature? Like, is this intrinsic to the way human civilization is, or is it specific to our current one? And then, to get towards, optimism, or at least a vector towards positive change, how do we get there? How do we get to a more sustainable way of having a human civilization on our planet? Maybe Vandana could start again.
Yeah.
If you like.
So, when Gandhi was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, it would be a good idea. Because for him, a civilization is something that has all the values and lasts over long period. Sustainability is the very definition of civilization. So when he said it would be a good idea, he saw the colonizing industrial age not as a civilization, but as a colonization. Now, the minute you have a colonization, you have one culture which is colonizing and another culture that's colonized. So it would be very wrong to equate all of that into human civilization. And I think the false universalisms of colonization is one of the baggages that we have to shed. People like us who grew up in the countries that were colonized, indigenous cultures everywhere who are living through colonization today and being killed for being Earth defenders, they have none of this illusion. They will never use the word human civilization. They will use the word Mother Earth, us as a part of Mother Earth. As Stephan said, we're children of the earth. And those civilizations have lasted millennia. Farming of Australian Aborigines, 60,000 years. My land, agriculture is another, everyone universalizes agriculture into industrial agriculture, that there's no other way it can be. We have farmed for 10,000 years without destroying the earth. And one thing people don't notice as the small farmers, India is a land of small farmers because of fights and saying our main work as agriculture is care for the earth, care for Mother Earth. And we can only do it when we are small farmers. Therefore, any policy that hands over our lands and agriculture to giant corporations is not just getting rid of us, which is a threat of extinction to us, but it is killing the very objective of farming as a culture. And that's what they say in these protests that today they've announced they will wrap up on the 11th. So, that is civilization. Our relationship with the living earth is civilization. And there's plurality in this, which is why we have to think of diversity as the organizing principle in nature and life. And, you know, when David was talking about uncertainty as the very condition of life, you know, I grew up in the Himalayan forest. And I was, you know, I'm 6-year-old, I saw a little book by Einstein. I said, this is what I want to be. And I started to study physics. And classical physics was so non-convincing to understand the world of nature for me. And that's why I followed all the way to quantum theory and did my PhD on non-locality and hidden variables in quantum theory. The issue of uncertainty is the issue of science, which is not Cartesian, which has gone out of the colonial mindset, the mechanistic. You needed the mechanist mindset to colonize. And if you look at the dates, you know, my book Staying Alive, my book Oneness was 1%, they actually show that the people who were creating the new industrial mechanistic science, the Bacons, were also deeply involved in colonization. They were deeply involved. I mean, Bacon was actually torturing farmers who were protesting against the enclosures of the commons. So I think we need to stop universalizing human civilization. We need to think of the different cultures, and we need to recognize that even today, in spite of all the violence, 80% of the biodiversity is on the lands of the indigenous people, which is only 25%. That alone should be a figure that should wake us up. But given that uncertainty is the very condition of our being, and dharma is our very duty, then two things follow from there. To stop chasing the Cartesian linear logic. So much of why people get disappointed is they can't find the certainty. Yeah, both because of the political co-option, but also because in a living earth, there's so many possibilities. But the place where we can create conditions of knowing what to do is knowing what action we should take. That's dharma. Knowing our relationships, doing the right thing. And again, doing the right thing, but not knowing what the outcome will be. Therefore, the Gita detachment. Do not. Do the right action. Engage in dharma, but be detached to what comes out of it. And that combination of deep commitment to compassion and reverence and love to the earth, and a deep detachment from the fruits of the action is the way it talks about here. That is what spirituality is about. So science teaches us that, spirituality teaches us that, and both are converging, but science has to be rescued from its instrumental reductionism to mechanistic science, linear prediction, determinism, you know, mastery, engineering, all of those, you know, 500 years of intellectual baggage that has really imprisoned our minds. That seems to be, to me, the problem. And you know, I mean, all of spiritual traditions are about how you can cultivate the mind to look differently at the world and live differently in the world.
Thank you. Stephan, would you like to reflect on that a little bit? Civilization.
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, I agree entirely with Vandana. You're absolutely right. And I think it's very important to point out about uncertainty. Now should be the core of science. I'm a scientist as well. I'm a scientific ecologist. And the uncertainty is the livingness of nature. You know, the fact that nature is a great soul or a great psyche. It souls behave in uncertain ways. We can't predict what a person is going to do, let alone the earth as a great person, as a great soul. But can we live without destroying Gaia? Yes, of course we can. But we have my friend Arnie Ness, who coined the term deep ecology. He had this nice phrase, which was Gaia gift. So, you know, we have to eat. If we go on agriculture, we have to cut down some native vegetation, forests perhaps, to grow for fields, you know. So Gaia gives us a gift. She says, look, you know, I love you humans. You're one of my finest inventions. You're amazing. You can look back on me and you can worship me in a very special way, which other beings can't do. So please have some land and grow some food in the way sort of Vandana has been describing. But you mustn't overstep the limits. That's the thing. You must, if you overstep the limits, then things get very, I'm afraid I get very unpleasant, you know, and we get climate change, we get all these problems we're facing now. So you better learn how to find where those limits are. And that's what I think in our modern situation where science can be very helpful. My colleagues in the sciences, in the Earth system sciences, James Lovelock included, we can do some sort of calculations, very rough calculations, to work out where are the boundaries, how much CO2 can we put in before we destabilize this climate and move away from the Holocene into the Anthropocene, which is what we're doing, and towards disaster, absolute disaster. How much? Well, we know roughly 350 parts per million carbon dioxide, you know, and we know how much biodiversity we should roughly. That's the use of, I think, the importance of science, the science of ecology. It gives us an idea of the boundaries where we are. Of course, we are surpassing so many of them now, the climate boundary, the biodiversity boundary, we've mentioned those already. So the answer is we have a Gaia gift. Gaia obviously wants us to be here, so to speak. And her allotment of her resources for developing our culture is very generous. You know, I mean, we can emit, I don't know, 3 gigatons of carbon atoms per year, I believe, into the atmosphere. That's 3,000 million tons. That's very generous. We're surpassing that by an order of 3 or 4, I think, magnitude of 3 or 4 already. So yes, we have a Gaia gift. We can do that. Are we intrinsically harmful to Gaia? No. Human beings are intrinsic lovers of Gaia. I'm completely convinced of that. Just like we breathe the air and we eat food, you know, and we have our biological functions. So as fundamental as that to every human is the fact that we love Gaia. She is our mother. And if we only learn to see the beauty of the sky, the song of the birds, the shape of a tree, as the expression of this miraculous planetary being, our mother, then, and of course, we can live well with Gaia. Better than that, I think in some way she needs our consciousness to adore her. Many of the great poets have said this, including one of my favorite poets, who is Tagore from India, who I really love. You know, that we're here to love Gaia. It's very simple. So I don't think we are intrinsically harmful to Gaia at all. Western culture, on the other hand, like Vandana said, of course, we went way, way off too far into the mechanistic worldview, which is it's a useful tool, but you can see how dangerous it is if we let it take over. Well, I think that's what I wanted to say, really, that I think Vandana's point about uncertainty is very, very deep, and it goes to the very core of the problem with Western science. I agree that we in science, we can't allow the uncertainty, because that means that nature has an agency, that it has a purpose, that it has a soul, that it has a mind, it has a will, which is bigger than our own. And we know from science that nature has no mind. Nature is just one vast, great dead machine. And that's a fundamental mistake of Western culture, which we have to correct very quickly.
Yeah, if I can follow up here on this mechanistic paradigm, and I think we're all in agreement here. In fact, I would add that I think there's a kind of self-contradiction or inconsistency, I'm not sure what the best word is, that the actual mechanistic paradigm in one way doesn't make sense. Like if you think about any machine, the presumption is that there's a machine maker, there's somebody who made the machine, and that's built into our understanding of mechanism. And I think as long as, you know, you in the old days, we had a all powerful creator God, you could understand it in that way, as Newton and many others did. But without that, I think what we can see is if there's no separate external machine maker, then what's going on? There's obviously something very different going on here in the kind of self-organization. So it's not as though meaning is something imposed from outside, but there's something integral. And I think that's what we really need to understand, that even our conception of the universe as mechanistic, ultimately, I think doesn't make sense. Returning to the question about what is unique about our civilization. I mean, one obvious example, which people have been talking about, is technology, and I think Vandana is really touching on something really important, something that Heidegger, actually, the German philosopher, made the point. He said, it's not simply that technology is an expression of science, but in a way, the technology is wearing the shoes. It's like the science is in service to the technology. And for various reasons, what happens is the technologies, like the economy, like the population, there's a sense of limitlessness in the way that they are sort of developing. I mean, I think just thinking about our economic system, that too, I think is one of the main and important differences, especially when you connect capitalism with technology. I've always been very impressed by what Karl Polanyi talked about in the Great Transformation, about how there was this really big change that happened that made the modern world as we know it possible, where the land, the earth was understood simply as land. People were reduced to labor, money to capital to be invested, and all of them simply become means to be exploited in the service of greater profit. And so if you combine that basic mindset of capitalism, and built into that is the idea that you always want more. You want more profit. You want more market share. You want more. It's like it fits my definition of greed, because as Aristotle pointed out, there's no natural endpoint and simply more, more, more. So if you combine that with capitalism, and for that matter, combine it with population, right? Combine it with the problem. I mean, if you have death control, which is to say modern medicine, at a certain point, you've really got to get a grip on birth control, or our species just kind of takes over. So in all of these cases, it seems to me, this is what has become unique about our civilization, and these are the ways in which we seem unable to live within limits. Yeah. Leave it at that.
Each of you has already touched a little bit on your spiritual practice. And in addition to being educators and scientists, each of you has a deep connection to your own spiritual tradition. And that's of course why you were invited to this dialogue, to talk about that bridge. In each of your work, you talk about this unity, some essential unity that underlies all life, how everything is interdependent, a message that's at the core of all the major spiritual traditions. So I wonder if you could address that directly, that how spirituality, whatever that means, can help us to heal the perceived divisions between us and nature, and help us address these crises, spirituality. So if you'd like to start, Vandana, again, you're welcome.
Yeah, I think these separations and, mutually excluded middles of the dualities, which first created the assumption of the dead earth, and in a way killed Gaia in the mind, then created a science without understanding interconnectedness, and therefore separated science as seeking instruments of control, including, and driven by the technologies you want, of course, as you said, the shoes. But then it also, by removing the sacred from the living earth, it put spirituality outside. Yeah. And I think that joining itself, that knowing a living earth that's sacred, and knowing our place on that living earth, which is our dharma, that is both the scientific search, at least for me it's been, and it is the spiritual search. And for both, the sources are many. Yeah, my original interconnectedness understanding came from quantum theory, but all of my remaining time, it's really ecological studies, understanding, observation, doing. I mean, if you aren't working with the soil, you can't know that the soil is living. Yeah, I have saved seeds all these years, and the power of the seed is a teacher on a daily basis. So I think we've got to overcome this, the false separation between science and spirituality that mechanistic science and the dead earth assumption has created for us. And all spiritual traditions basically teach us that we are here because of the living earth, we have to take care of her. And, because Christianity is the ground where the greed economy grew, Christianity itself was genetically engineered to fit into greed. And I see the religious wars in Germany as part of that. I see that first papal bull knowing with the living earth, witchcraft, 9 million people were killed in Europe. Yeah, the three things we don't connect is colonialism, the enclosures of the commons, and the burning of witches. It was part of one phenomena of constructing a whole new system. And again, the narrative makes us believe that there was the rule of Christianity, and in a way, reductionist mechanistic science liberated us from that. No, every player in the mechanistic science was the new religious player, who was also a colonizing actor. Read Boyle, who represented the New England Church, also the Boyle's Law. But he said the idea that the earth is sacred is an impediment to our empire over lesser creatures, and that included indigenous people, and of course, all of our family and all of our relatives. And it gave rise to this illusion of control. It gave rise to the illusion of mastery. And I think we have to just like we have to repair the broken idea, the idea we are separate from nature, we have to also repair the brokenness between science and spirituality and show that deep ecology leads to a science that is deeply spiritual.
Yes, Stephan.
Yes. Well, of course, I entirely agree with Vandana, as you would expect. But I would say that also, in my practice, I have what I call a Gaia place. So it's a place, I think we should all have Gaia places. These are places where we can cultivate our spirituality of Gaia. And for example, I've got one very close to where I'm sitting now by a stream. It doesn't take me long to get there. And I go there, I try to go there every day. And I take a little stool to sit on and some water to drink. And I just go and sit this incredible place in a little bit of ancient forest that we have here. And I spend half an hour, and I quieten my mind. I just look at the beauty of this amazing place with, whatever's growing in front. There's some big tree trunks, and there's some ivy growing, and there's a stream. And I notice my mind calming, and an opening happens in my Gaia place, and I receive sort of messages, it sounds corny to say it, but the earth begins to teach us. All we have to do is, I like the idea of a Gaia place. For me, go and sit in my Gaia place. I've got several Gaia places, each one with different qualities. And then I spend time there. And then I come back and I do whatever work I have to do. It might be some gardening, it might be some writing or speaking or whatever it is. But if I don't go to my Gaia place, then eventually I notice how all those activities take on a rather hollow tone, and there's a sort of emptiness in it. As soon as I listen to my voice, sometimes quite strong, go to your Gaia place now. You don't have to sit in front of the computer, do that later, go now. Then I always come back really deeply nourished, and I'm amazed at how much I've learned just by sitting there in my Gaia place. So I think that's you could call that a spiritual practice. It's open to everyone. You don't have to have a forest like we're lucky to have here. You can even be indoors. I've had students who've been in Brazil in the lockdown, and they've created Gaia places out of plants in their apartment, just some beautiful plants. I've got one like that for the winter in England. I've got an indoor Gaia place, very small one with some plants on a table. Just somewhere where you can really feel the presence of Gaia. It's really it's a mysterious presence. It's hard to say what it is, but it's an intelligence. It's a comfort. It's a healer. She's a healer. And I think that spirituality is very down to earth, very connecting with the earth, very connecting. And as Vandana says, a science comes out of this, a new kind of science in which the basic motivation is not control, but love, or participation, as our dear friend Brian Goodwin used to say, participation. We want to participate with Gaia and move back within the boundaries that we know from the science. And this, if we won't do that without spirituality, we have to have spirituality. Everyone needs to feel this in some way very quickly, everywhere in the world. Everyone needs to have this very humble Gaian experience of the earth being alive somehow. And how are we going to get that to happen? Well, as you said, we do what we can in our lives, and then we let go of the results. This is the Bhagavad Gita, isn't it, Vandana? We just sort of
it is.
Yeah. I love that wisdom. Krishna, Krishna talking to Arjun, isn't it? I think, if I remember. Yeah, just act and don't be attached to the action. Satish Kumar, our dear friend, also says that an awful lot. So, see, one last thing. I find that Indian spirituality is very, very, very powerful. I think, if I may say so, Vandana, India has such a fantastic ecological civilization. The time of the Buddha. Wow. Really, I mean, Tagore writes about it in the ancient forest hermitages, the Tapavana, and the Gayatri mantra, for example, giving thanks to the intelligence of the universe that she may light up our minds. That's the sort of spirituality we need. And it comes from the earth, and Indian culture, traditional culture, has so much to teach us about that, as do all the other great cultures of the world, but India especially in many ways, I think.
Well, in a way, that's a kind of a natural transition to what I was thinking about. But maybe starting out first by just commenting, the idea of karma yoga, action without attachment to the results of action seems to me really essential. And you also find it in Buddhism, including East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. But listening to what Stephan was saying about Gaia place, I was reminded of what the Buddha did when he left on his spiritual quest, right? I mean, he had been living in these supposedly 3 different palaces, but he went off into the natural world by himself. And he found, and he practiced with a couple of teachers and he meditated, but he basically found what he was looking for in the natural world. And it's really important to remember that. And it's not just the Buddha. I mean, I'm struck. What did Jesus do after his baptism? He went off into the desert, into the natural world, where he fasted and prayed for 40 days and 40 nights. Clearly, something really powerful happened to him there. Or Moses, his burning bush on top of a mountain by himself, or Muhammad in his cave. In all of these cases, and we can talk about more, but it seems to me they found truly something extraordinary, transformative, and whatever transformation happened to them, it was something that then they were able to bring back into society and create some new vision, some new path that people found so very valuable. I think it's unfortunate that today, I mean, just speaking, say, for Buddhists, we do most of our meditation inside, 4-walled rooms, where we have control of the windows and the screens and the insects and humidity and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that's very convenient in some ways, but we can't help but ask ourselves, what is it that is lost? And I think that there is something significant there that does need to be recuperated. And in a way, that's what our Eco-Dharma Center is really concerned about. I teach courses on the Eco-Dharma path, and basically, as much as possible, weather permitting, and it usually does, we're outside, we're meditating under trees, in meadows full of wildflowers, or next to a little river there. And there's something very, and it's so different from what people are often doing. And then it's on the basis of that grounding, a meditation that encourages us not to sort of go inside, but to sort of open up into what the natural world has to offer. And then we emphasize gratitude, the gratitude of practice, of feeling grateful. It took me a long time to realize that gratitude is actually a practice, a very important transformative one. And then it's only after those days that then we get into kind of a group circle discussion, sharing our grief, sharing our fear, sharing our anger about what the hell's going on. And because we've been together 24/7, building a kind of a sangha, a community of trust, we're able to let go and open up and feel this grief that I think we all feel, and we all tend to repress, and then it paralyzes us, and we don't know what to do. And it's after that, then we even go further. People go off in a solo by themselves. They'll spend 2 nights in a beautiful place on our land or nearby, where they're, in a way, you could say, digesting or assimilating or whatever. But we're asking people, don't think in your head what you want to do, but open up. What do the trees, what do these plants and animals, what do they have to offer you? And we're finding that it's a way that it can help people reconnect, and also not just reconnect and heal personally, but by de-repressing the grief, people can take that next step of saying, okay, what can I do? What do I want to do? And then people can become engaged in a more powerful way. I'm not sure if I went off topic there, but it seemed important, or relevant.
That was perfect. Each of you is a wonderful example of how much one person how much positive impact one person can have with their life. And so to wrap up this part of the discussion, I wonder if each of you could just say what we could do for people listening. What activities could each of us take up in our daily lives to help with the climate and environmental crises? We're used to hearing, the little things we can do at home, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on what's most effective too. There's a lot of things we can each do. Where should we put our energy? We can go in reverse if you like. David, you want to start?
Well, I'm happy to go first if no one else wants to jump in here. That's a question I get a lot, as a result of the kind of eco-dharma practice retreat that I just talked about, but also because I wrote this book on eco-dharma, and now we have this new movement in Buddhism called the Eco-Sattva path. And frankly, I think that might be the single most important thing that Buddhism has to offer. The tradition is what's called the Bodhisattva, and the basic idea there is that we practice not simply for our own liberation, for our own awakening, but although that continues, our own meditation, etc., but we're also engaged. We realize that, well, one way to say it is the more we wake up, the more we realize how interconnected we are with everyone else, and therefore the ultimate path is not simply about what's in it for me, but what can I do, what can I contribute to helping everyone else, and indeed the earth as well. Anyway, to say it briefly, what I've come up with is, there are obviously certain things that we can all do, like reducing our carbon footprint, etc. But more generally, we're different. We have different abilities. We're in different places. And what I find myself recommending more and more often is like a 3-part meditation, where I encourage people to do this quite slowly, maybe over weeks, for people to ask themselves, number one, what do I have to offer? In particular, are there distinctive skills, abilities, etc., taking account of my total situation in terms of, do I need money? Am I retired? How healthy am I? What are my networks, and so forth? That's the first question. The second question is, what are the really good options for my energy in terms of where I am? Obviously, there's so many things that need to be done. There's no point trying to do everything. That'll just spread ourselves too thin. But and this may require a little bit of research, but what are the really good opportunities? And the third final part, which in a way maybe is the most important, having digested those first two, letting them go and sort of meditating and really kind of getting in touch with your own heart and asking, where does my love? Where does my awareness, where does my energy want to go? And this is something that takes us beyond ego, beyond our usual, it's not just calculative thinking, but it's really opening up. What tugs at my heart? What really pulls me? Where can I make a difference? And the reason I emphasize that, I think, is we're all so different. I don't know that I can answer those questions for anybody else, but it might be a good way for each of us to find the way forward.
That's a nicely anti-colonial message, I think, you have to discover for yourself. Stephan, how about you?
Yeah, as David was speaking, the image came of my friend Per Ingvar Haukeland in Norway, calls the ecosophical tree, the tree of deep ecology. And so the roots go down into the soil, which is the soil of deep experience, real connection with nature. And different roots go to different parts of that soil. So different people have different kinds of deep experiences. We have different kinds of deep experiences on different days. And then they come together, all those roots come together in the trunk of the tree, which Arnie would call the deep ecology platform. And they're just sort of 8 statements we can ponder. The first one is, all life has intrinsic value, irrespective of its usefulness to humans. Everything has everything matters because it exists. I mean, it's a very deep statement. And then it goes on, and the last one is, it's something like, we humans have no right to destroy nature other than to satisfy our vital needs. And we need different politics, different science, different technology. If we agree with all these things, we have to contribute to making the changes. That's the trunk. And then the branches are, what options do I have? Just as you were saying, David, the branches of the tree. What options do I have in my life as a parent, in my life as a scientist, in my life as a teacher? And then when you come to the tip of a branch or a flower, you make a fruit. And the fruit is the actual action. That's when you've done something. And then it falls to the ground and it rots and it fertilizes the deep experience, the soil of deep experience for everyone, including more than human beings, other than human beings. So, the image of a tree is very nice. It's a very archetypal image. And one can ask oneself, okay, where right now is my deep experience in the soil of Gaia, the deep experience of Gaia? And do I agree with these 8 points? Well, of course I do. Of course, life has intrinsic value. And of course, we can't destroy so much. Of course, we have to have a different culture. How can I contribute? And I think the image of the tree can help this process you were talking about, David, to come to the fore, because it comes from the depths of the unconscious, the tree, the alchemical tree, the archetypal tree, the tree of life. It's a very powerful image which can help us in our deep questioning to discover what we can do, what we can contribute in this crisis.
Vandana.
Yeah, both David and Stephan have brought us where we need to, wake to a living Gaia. Yeah, that I think the denial, people talk about climate denialism, but the real denialism is of Gaia herself. Mm-hmm. And that's the sickness. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what's making the planet sick. That's what's making us sick. And the Earth's health, the metabolic diseases show up as climate change and toxics all over. And our metabolic diseases show up as the chronic diseases. And the two have deep connection because we are of the Earth. Yeah. As Stephan so clearly said, this idea of not only are we separate, but we are superior. Mm-hmm. These are the constructs. They are so crude and immature, both coming from India and having my PhD in quantum theory. I said, how can they keep using this language? If you read some of the false solutions, in England, you're having these new debates on gene editing GMOs. Yeah. We have regulations. And you constantly pretend you're coming with something new when you're coming with the old in new clothes. It's still the old that has caused the destruction. I ended up, as I said, working in finding ways to do an agriculture of nonviolence in our relationship with the earth, because my studies were showing that an industrial agriculture was the biggest cause of soil erosion, water depletion, biodiversity extinction, and climate change. This single biggest contribution. And by eating consciously, by knowing how in the food we eat is the life of the soil, in the food we eat is the sunshine, in the food we eat, we have the results of photosynthesis that change carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. And, that's the Gaia hypothesis, that the photosynthesis is what led to the cooling of the planet through a self-organized, self-regulatory system and brought the temperatures down from 290 degrees to 13 degrees average, brought the carbon dioxide down from 4,000 parts per million to 270 parts per million. Now, that is Gaia's technology. So when we appropriate technology to ourselves, we become bind to Gaia's technologies. But she has ways of transformation that are so much more sophisticated than the transformations of crude, heavy, fossil fuel driven, mechanistic thought that is just heavy in destruction. And it's learned to see its destruction as power. And I remember, we launched the organic movement of India at Gandhi's ashram. And I thought Gandhi's ashram would be organic. And I found them spraying. And I said, why are you doing this? And this a French scientist came and sprayed. And the birds fell and the insects fell. And we were so impressed by the power. They said, you call yourselves Gandhians? And you were impressed with violent power? I said, where's Gandhi's teaching of nonviolence and ahimsa? So I think ahimsic eating, nonviolent eating, can be very radical because it connects us to the soil, to the sun, to the green leaf. And I don't like the word of decarbonization because living carbon is life. Dead fossilized carbon is the problem. Now, the problem is not equal to the living carbon. So just like we can't take a destructive colonizing culture and call it civilization and humanize it, we cannot take the fossil carbon and reduce all of the world's rich carbon in the molecule of life. So I think these are lessons of deep ecology. These are lessons of science. These are lessons of Gaian theory. These are lessons of ecological agriculture. Eating to me is the most radical act, eating with consciousness. It is the most destructive act today. But if we do it with a continuation of it being commodity-based, lab-based food, breast milk from labs as climate solution. I mean, if you see the nonsense that's coming out as climate solutions, we've done whole reports on this, then you realize that there's only one science and there's only one technology. The science is the science of Gaia, and we participated. Dear Brian Goodwin used to so repeatedly tell us. I was just rereading his book, Why the Leopard Changes. So, Maywan Ho, Brian gave us the science that we need today. And second, that there are technologies in nature. Indigenous cultures have had technology. The fact that their tools were not heavy was not their primitiveness, but their sophisticatedness of oneness with the earth, and therefore causing no harm to any strand of life. So we just have to widen our horizon and cultivate a diversity of the mind, and through it, a diversity of life, and through it, celebrate the multiple pathways that are available to us. And instead of despairing that there's uncertainty, celebrate it.
Thank you. That's very inspiring. Well, it's time to go to questions. And we have a few people raising their hands. One person, Michelle, had her hand raised for half an hour. So if you still have a question, feel free to raise it. We can't do that in real life, only on Zoom. But Michelle, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand again. But we can start then with Abelardo, who's also been waiting. Go ahead.
For myself?
Yeah, please, if you have a question.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Stephan. I don't know if you remember me.
I do remember you. Hello. How are you?
Very good. I'm from Costa Rica also.
Yeah, I remember you. I remember you very well. Yes.
Yeah. And well, my question, it's mostly directed to David Loy, but I think it touches on what all of you have been saying, which I agree with completely. I'm inspired about Gaia, this interdependent vision. But being a Buddhist myself also, don't you think that the major contribution that Buddhism can give us is the whole knowledge about how self-grasping ignorance and self-centered attitude are at the core of all of our problems, and on the basis of everything you've talked about that is driving what we call this civilization. linking that to the kind of education that Stephan was, talking that we need this Gaia consciousness. I mean, is that enough, or can we link these two approaches? And how could we do this? That's my basic question.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really well said and very important. And that's why Buddhism begins with looking at the nature of our own mind and how it functions and how it is that often creates dukkha, suffering. So that is kind of the heart of traditional Buddhist practice. The problem, I think, is that has become how to say it, in a way divorced from the larger situation that we are non-dual with. Actually, when I go back to the early Buddhist teachings, it seems to me, frankly, that the Buddha was a lot more progressive than the institution that developed after he died, especially when you look at his attitude toward women and caste. But, you know, historically, in order to survive and thrive, you had to make peace with the powers that be. And so I think what Buddhism became, it became so focused on our own minds and transforming our own minds and the dukkha and karma connected with it, that it has encouraged a kind of dissociation from the rest of the world. And I think we see that now in the resistance to eco-dharma. You know, there's still a lot of people who think that, to be socially engaged is a distraction from the essential practice. And, maybe I'll do that when I'm fully enlightened or whatever. And I think what's really important at this point to realize, number one, Buddhism has this tradition of being able to transform every time it's, this is how it integrates its own emphasis on impermanence and insubstantiality. Whenever it goes to a new culture, it actually becomes something quite different. I mean, the Buddha didn't teach Zen Buddhism, for example. And so now that Buddhism comes to the modern world, a world where, as Noam Chomsky said last year, this is the most dangerous moment in human history, we really need to ask ourselves, what does the Buddhist tradition have to offer here? The danger is that our preoccupation with understanding and focusing on our own grasping can be so complete that it can actually reinforce the fundamental problem. It's all about me, my well-being, my enlightenment. And in a way, the whole point of the practice, as I see it, is realizing at a certain point that at the core is the duality, the delusion of separation from other people and indeed the rest of the world, the delusion of separation from the earth. And that's why the Bodhisattva path is so important, why we have to realize that to be engaged socially and ecologically is not ultimately a distraction from the path, but it more and more has become an essential part of the path, that this is how we integrate whatever changes are happening as we begin to get beyond our own sort of self-preoccupation and actually transform our self-centered habits in terms of engaging with other people. So I guess all that's a long way of saying, I think at this particular point in history, we need to expand our understanding of Buddhist practice and Buddhist engagement to realize it requires this kind of engagement with the world. And I think that's slowly, not always rapidly, it's beginning to happen. Yeah.
Michelle, I think if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question. You waited very patiently.
Yeah, thanks. Well, also it gave me a little bit of time to find the right question that I could have here. I have another device going here. I hope nobody can hear that. So actually, this is somewhat directed to Vandana Shiva and also to Stephan, but also to, David. So actually, I've been recently reading one of your older books, and I discovered it a month ago in Spain. And you had quoted about an author who, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the book is called The Hindu View of Life. And he quotes, Hinduism is more a way of life than a way of thinking. And Vandana, as that's sort of the approach that you've been, I suppose, working towards? And is that something that's still in your mind? Do you remember that book that you wrote?
Yeah, no, I didn't write a book with that
Oh,
title. I think somebody used some of my lectures and put something together. So the word Hindu merely means the land beyond the Indus. That's all it means.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Hindustan was the place. So it's not a religion, it's a geographical indicator. And that's why when the British colonized India, and they wanted to create these separations and the divide and rule, the splits between the Muslims and the Hindus and all of that. When they created the census, 1911, and they'd ask religion, and people would put, I'm a Hindu Muslim, I'm a Buddhist Hindu, I'm a, people had multiple faiths, and you could hold multiple faiths together. Because this law of exclusion of the middle that polarization creates hadn't been institutionalized as a colonial instrument of divide and rule. Why did we have partition? Because the British first created the politics of hate, which we are living through. If Noam Chomsky has said we are in a very dangerous moment, the dangerous moment is not just that we have harmed Gaia so much, but we have changed our very sense of thinking who we are as human beings. Because that divide and rule is still vital for the new conquests. And if you see the way hate and fear is multiplied on social media, and all the time the Facebooks and the Twitters get implicated, but they've kind of gone beyond the reach of any governance and their complaints, but they feed this hate and fear today. So the word Hindu, like I said, is a geographical indicator. It refers to the multiple trajectories. And the beauty is, all of the recognition of nature as sacred, just the different ways of celebrating, all the different ways. And there's nothing like saying, this is Hinduism. There's no text that says, this is the Bible. There is no path that says this is the only path, and which is also the reason why with corporate globalization, and I worked with the International Forum on Globalization to show what it was all about, that it was colonialism revisited, it was greed on absolute fast forward. And then I wrote the book Earth Democracy, because I could see that on the one hand was greed destroying Gaia, greed then insulating itself from people uniting for the divide and rule, and meantime, reducing our identities, making us forget who we are. That we are, first identity we forget is we are of the earth, we are of Gaia. The second identity we forget is we are of place, and therefore we are part of community. And that means there are multiple relationships that shape us. And the third identity we forget is, we are biological beings, we are ecological beings, and nurturing that being is true freedom. That's why I work on food freedom. That's why I work on water freedom. And I think Stephan talked about it as Gaia's gift. That Gaia's gift is our relationship at the metabolic level, and we have to overcome this metabolic rift. And I think what the British did was they decided who would write what Muslim Islam was, who would tell us what Hindus. They picked the most fundamentalist characters out of Indian society and said, you tell. And this will be in our record of defining Islam and Hinduism. And it's, and they didn't even know how to write, the word Hindu in their text of that period is Gentoo, Gentoo. Look at the literature of that time. So let's not get messed up with words. I love my civilization, both because, Tagore said this, the West had it learning from brick and mortar, and we learned from the forest. And that's why we are an ecological civilization. But I also love the fact that India escaped the prison of semantics. It escaped the one word to describe a very pluralistic universe. We name the Ganga in 1,000 ways. We name the Mother Earth in 1,000 ways. We name the divine feminine in 1,000 ways. And I think we need to come back to the dance of pluralism to escape all these polarizations.
Andy has a question. Would you like to ask?
Yeah. My question is about the relationship between consciousness and power. I've been very inspired by all of you, so I'm very grateful. Thank you, all four of you, actually. And you've talked a lot about civilization, and we sort of generally seem to be talking about the need, quite an urgent need, to transition to a new civilization. And in that process, the old civilization has to give way or collapse or transform or whatever. I don't know how it might happen. But it's about power in a way, because the problem is that the grip of, let's call it capitalism, for want of a better term, neoliberalism, I don't mind what term we use, mechanistic industrial growth society and so forth. What interests me is the role of consciousness. We're talking about spirituality, deep ecology. In a way, we're talking about consciousness as an agent of change. And I completely agree with what David said about Buddhism and individuality. And we need to move much more to working collectively. And I do believe, and this is where my sort of optimism comes, I do believe that there is a transformation of consciousness going on globally, an awakening to the challenges of this situation. And so I just want to ask, I don't mind, maybe Stephan actually, because he hasn't spoken recently, about the relationship between consciousness and power and the possibility of transformation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question. I think the more consciousness one has, the more aware one is about how to use the power that consciousness gives you with tremendous care and attention. You know, we have of course, the real consciousness actually makes you extremely humble. I think actually when you're very conscious, you don't have that much power, actually. You give up the power. You can't be conscious if you have a sense of power over. That isn't consciousness. That's not consciousness at all. Consciousness is, I think, when you realize you don't have power, or rather, you realize who has the power, and you can guess who has the power, right? I mean, this is obvious. It's Gaia. Gaia has the power. The universe has the power. When we're very conscious, we're conscious of not exactly our powerlessness. I wouldn't put it like that either. We're conscious that we're just humble humans. We're just humble, and our power is very limited. And the energy that we have, you know, from our metabolism, from our bodies, we want to offer now to make Gaia a better place for us all. So the scientific consciousness, which Vandana has been speaking about, and which I know too as a scientist, that's a very limited kind of consciousness, and that has given us power over nature, and that's a very limited and very dangerous kind of consciousness, in which, you know, we see the world as a machine. We think we can predict and control it, and we use that sort of sense of power to dominate nature. That isn't consciousness, really. That's not consciousness. That would say, what can we call that? An aberration of consciousness, maybe, or a perversion of consciousness, but it's not consciousness. Consciousness is humble. Consciousness is mild. Consciousness is holistic. Consciousness is Gaian. Consciousness is soft and gentle and loving towards the earth. It's not about power. So I think to be conscious, we have to give up the notion of power. We have to be free. We have to free ourselves from the notion that we have this power because of our consciousness. On the other hand, we have the right to look after ourselves and to make ourselves happy in the world. Is that power? No, I'd rather suggest wisdom is better. I mean, sorry to be so corny. I would rather suggest consciousness is wisdom. Consciousness is not power. I would say it's wisdom. It's the word we need there.
Could I follow up on that a little bit? Because, you know, there's another way of talking about that I think can be helpful here. You know, Buddhism talks a lot about no self or non-self, and it talks about the fundamental delusion of separation, that there's a me inside and the rest of the world outside. And, you know, in modern language, the Buddhist claim about anatta, no self, could be understood as saying that our usual sense of self is a psychological and social construct. You know, babies aren't born with the self, with the sense of ego self that we develop. But the problem is, being a construct, this sense of self doesn't refer to anything sort of self-existing. It has no reality of its own. And that's important because I think this ego self, you know, this neoliberal product, you can look at it in those terms, it's inherently insecure. It's inherently uncomfortable. In Buddhist terms, it's inherently dukkha. And I think we experience that as a sense of lack, the feeling something is wrong with me, something is missing, something isn't quite right, I'm not good enough. And I think we can understand a lot of the preoccupation with power is people see that as one way to sort of try to fill up their sense of lack. If I'm powerful enough, if I'm rich enough, if I'm famous enough, if I'm beautiful enough, whatever. We have all of these, what I call lack projects, whereby we try to fill up this bottomless void at the core of our being. And I think that kind of consciousness, and I think we'd all agree it's a kind of a deluded consciousness, can be understood as very much at the root of the kind of problems that we're talking about now. And it also applies collectively. You know, it's not simply that this works on the individual level, but I think you could even look in terms of our civilization, understanding progress in the sense of unlimited growth. You could understand this as a kind of a collective lack project that can never satisfy, that can never kind of come to an end. So following up from what Stephan said, you know, this issue of power, as long as the power is craved and needed in this fashion, it's going to be problematic, it's going to be destructive. The question is, what other kinds of power become open up to us when we can let go of this delusion of separation and plug into the great power of Gaia.
Vandana, would you like to add anything about this consciousness?
Yeah, no, while both Stephan and David were talking, you know, I'm thinking of the fact that the word for nature in India is prakriti. Pra first, kriti the first action, the first creative power. Yeah, and we are obviously we are her children, so we are derived forms. Yeah, and I think basically what I have learned over many decades of both practice and search is there is violent power in destructive form, and it parades as the only kind of power. And then there's creative power in non-violent form. It's the power of the plant, the power of the seed to become an oak tree. It's the power of humanity in oneness and compassion. So that creative power is where powerlessness of the self, yeah, becomes a uniting power of our interconnectedness.
Thank you. Christina, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been really amazing to hear the discussion so far and really inspirational. I just wanted to ask a question. I'd like to hear Vandana's thoughts on it, but obviously everyone as well, because it's been such great insights from everybody. So I take a lot of comfort and lessons from nature, but particularly animals. And I feel as though a lot of the kind of humans have separated themselves, especially in the West, from animals, and you know that's linked as well to colonialism and white supremacy. This kind of separating humans from other animals. and I feel like that's also created a lot of the issues that are being discussed this evening. So I'm just interested to hear everyone's thoughts on how, or if you think that humans might learn lessons from other animals, and how, you know, reconnecting with our own animality might be of use in these discussions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the first thing is to remember we are animals, yeah, and therefore to separate ourselves from the animal world is to separate ourselves from who we are as ecological beings. And then starts all the denialisms, yeah, and starts all the fabrication, you know. We don't really, you know, the food is not the connector. I mean, all my books I write about food is the currency of life, because the nutrition cycle is the foundational cycle. But if food is the currency of life, you treat food in one way. It's growing, it's eating, it's processing in a totally different way. And that's the non-violent system. But if food is purely a commodity for consumption, then all kinds of construction start. So Descartes says when you torture an animal, you know, it's just the creaking of the machine. So don't take it seriously. Don't treat it as a sentient being. Or then putting animals in factory farms, which was so violent. Now, the interesting thing is at COP26, nothing was said about factory farms. But my dear beloved Mr. Gates, who has preoccupied me since 2015 and the Paris Summit, he's written a whole book. And the false universalism, where, you know, the real recognition of violence is to see that factory farms are the wrong place for animals to be. There should be no animal in a factory farm. No animal should be feeding on soybean and GM soybean. They should be allowed to eat the grass. They're herbivores. He's twisted that around. Factory farms have disappeared from the discourse. And the problem is the cow herself. The problem in his book is the cow has 4 stomachs. Oh my God, her 4 stomachs are the leading to methane. And, you know, there's such fabrication of basic science going on. And just because you're a billionaire who wants to make more trillions now out of these fake narratives linked to huge technological investments, you know, lab food, like what's it called? Impossible Burger, 14 patents. Silicon Valley's biggest investment right now. Who are the billionaires of the world today? Big tech. Where do they want to invest their money? In fake food. And then they want to rewrite our relationship to the extent that they want to criminalize our relationship with the animals. And I get this all the time. The other day I was addressing a Delhi University college. And after my whole thing on ecofeminism and, you know, living Earth, women are alive, I get a question. Oh, you know, our cooperative dairy, we are the biggest cooperative dairy of the world. One woman with 1 cow, one woman with 2 cows, living with the cows as their family. You go to the villages, you know, the cows and they live together. And the cow is mother, just like Gaia is mother. The cow is Gau Mata, sacred mother. And you recognize, you take care of her, you love her, and she's bringing you, you're a landless peasant. She's bringing you the gift that you can send your child to school. Yeah? And out of the blue, this propaganda machine is so big, people are so worried. And I have to tell them, I said, no, the relationship of animals with humans in most cultures is of relatives, of love, of care, of oneness, no inequality, but the fact that not only must you take care of them, that they are taking care of you, there would be no economy without them. And, I'm trying to bring in the pastoralists, the farmers, and conscious consumers to understand that we can have a better relationship with animals through more conscious eating and not go into the next step of the factory food by saying, make every plant disappear, make every animal disappear, spray the plants with herbicide and Roundup, and get rid of the cows. They're all methane emitting factories. You feed cows grass. I grew up with my mother's, in my mother's cow shed. It never stank. The CAFOs, the concentrated animal farm operations, have a stink. That's the methane. Yeah, the methane stink is in factory farms. It's not on the sheep in the highlands. It is not in the camels in the desert. It's not in the free-range cows. So I think, very sadly, not only did we forget Gaia, not only did we forget the sentient beings of animals, we literally have forgotten true science. And I think knowledge itself, is under severe threat. The knowledge that comes from Gaia and guides us to live at peace with her, that knowledge is under severe threat. And we have to be, for me, consciousness is having, intelligence is separating, discriminating between falsehood and truth, or the toxics that you need to take or not take, that is intelligence. And to allow propaganda to colonize your mind, you are giving up your consciousness, you're giving up your intelligence. So yes, we need a future with lots of animals loving us and us loving them.
Dave Applebaum, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute, and thank you to everybody for what has been a really incredibly stimulating evening. I guess my question is, there's been agreement tonight, I think, that in order to combat the terrible problems we're facing now in nature, we need a transformation of consciousness. Will this transformation of consciousness come quickly enough? Are enough people really understanding the depths of the problem, things, the deep ecological significance of the problem, in order to make this consciousness come about in a human race? And before I stop, can I just say, I remember when I was a young man in the early 1980s, when Capra wrote The Tao of Physics and The Turning Point, when David Bohm wrote Wholeness in the Implicit Order, when Lovelock wrote Gaia. At that time, it seemed to me that with all these books coming along, the consciousness was really rising, and we were very close. And yet 40 years have passed, and it seems to me that the world we're living in has got much, much, much worse, and the materialistic mindset is extraordinarily strong. So, is there some hope that we are really close to this?
Scott, can I respond to that?
Oh yeah, of course, Vandana, please.
Yeah. Because I'm part of so many movements in the world and in solidarity with the indigenous people everywhere, they're rising. So I think the first thing we need to recognize is, not everyone needs a change in consciousness. In some places, defending your ecological civilization and the consciousness that goes with it is what has to happen. Yeah. And not all the world is basically in all the addictions of mechanistic thought, industrialism, fossil fuel civilization, colonized economies, extractive economies. A large part of the world is there. You join the women of the world, you join the small farmers of the world, and you join the indigenous people of the world. We are talking of the majority thinking through and with Gaia. That's the reality of where we are today. Yes, in the privileged world, it looks less. And there seems to be a decline from the days of David Bohm. And part of our work is to not allow a forgetting of all those amazing gifts of people who've gone before, because there's a huge erasure taking place. Yeah. I mean, if Bill Gates can say the stomachs of the cow are wrong, therefore get rid of the cow, you can see what kind of erasure is going on. Quantum theory itself, the deep philosophy of it being erased by a whole new mechanistic hyper globalization. So I think it looks like it's not growing the consciousness in the West. But even in the West, two things. The solidarity is growing. Otherwise, why would people on the streets in Glasgow have so much unity? Just think of it. Yeah, there was none of these divisions there. Everyone was united. But the second thing is this new wave of colonization, about which I've written in Oneness verse 1%. Just like the first wave colonized internally through witchcraft and enclosures of the commons while they colonized our lands, this colonization is really based on the deciding 99% of humanity doesn't have a place on this planet. We need their resources for the $4,000 trillion economy is what BlackRock is talking about, by financializing and commodifying and monetizing nature's function. 4,000 trillion. They're 4.5 they're 9.5 now. They're looking at money to be made at every little creativity of Gaia and extractive functions now. Earlier, they extracted raw materials. So, of course, we have to recognize how greed has gone out of any context of regulation. Greed can never be self-regulated. Compassion can. But greed is now destroying all the social, spiritual, ecological regulatory processes. And solidarity is where it has to grow, including the fact, I think that, David talked about the constructs. I think people of the West should stop living in the construct of prosperity and recognize the disposability. I mean, I studied in Canada. Every day there are fights because people have lost their homes, they can't pay their rents, they're living in parks and the police is coming and removing them. They're shooting people on the beaches of Los Angeles. Yeah? This is not a happy picnic, even for the West just now. And so we all need Gaia to rise to a different occasion. Some places where we never gave up our deep love for her, in other places where that can be cultivated, also for the human future, because there is no human future in this current paradigm.
Can I say a little bit as well? I think it's important to have places where people can come together to explore these issues and cultivate this new consciousness, this new Gaian consciousness. And I think Schumacher College has been one of those places over the last 30 years where Vandana has taught many times and David has visited. And I think these places are very, very powerful. So if you can find yourself a group or somewhere like Schumacher College, based on Schumacher College, where you can really explore these issues very deeply with other people together, even on Zoom, then I think that really helps a lot. That gives a tremendous amount of hope. It's like, we take a little pickaxe and all we have to do is crack the shell of our Western worldview, just a tiny little bit, just make a little hole in it with a little pickaxe of thought and poetry or music. And out comes the sort of water of life underneath this little shell that Western culture has put over the life of Gaia. It's as if this water of life, the Gaian water of life, is just waiting to come up, just waiting to nourish us. It's just waiting for us to make that move. And that's what gives me, if we talk about hope again, I know we shouldn't talk about hope, but that's what gives me hope that, deep underneath in the psyche wants wholeness. The psyche wants us to feel this healing water that she has, and the tree of life and the mandala, all these wonderful symbols that are there waiting for us in our unconscious, in our dream life. They're there waiting to help us. All we have to do is come together and help each other to cultivate this kind of Gaian awareness together in various places. Schumacher College, where David is working, and Vandana's college in India, or just in your neighborhood with some people. So get together with others. Let's get together with each other. Just about animals, just very briefly, I'd like to say, in science, we're now recognizing that animals have subjectivity. They're subjects, So when a bird lands on a branch, it's not a machine that's landing on a branch. It's a being that sees you, that has an opinion about you, a being that wants something, a being that looks after itself, that has its own interests, that has its purposes, that has consciousness and subjectivity. That's a very important view of animals that we've lost in the West. I'm talking about wild animals as well as domestic animals that Vandana was speaking of.
And if I could add to that too, well, first of all, with the animals, I mean, I think this is one of the striking examples of the difference between the West and India. that Vandana has been talking about, because it's quite striking in the Abrahamic traditions. For example, you know, the 10 commandments of Moses, don't kill. It was very clear, always clear, that that was about not killing other human beings. And built into that was the sense, you know, the Genesis idea of our superiority over all the other species. Whereas it's so striking that in India, you know, the idea of not to kill, it's very clear. It's about sentient beings in general, including the bird that Stephan just talked about, that it's not simply, so in a way that bifurcation between humans and all the other species, my sense is very much that within India, that is not found in the way that it is. And of course, that's what the Abrahamic developed into the philosophies behind the West, and so I think that became built in here. But if I can go back to the question about whether or not the change of consciousness can happen quickly enough, and of course I think that's really the essential, the $64 question. And the answer, to be quite frank, is I think we don't know, given the kinds of technological power and destructive forces that are in operation today. But there are a couple other factors that I just want to add to what Vandana and Stephan mentioned. You know, one of them is I think there's a deeper realization among more and more people that modern Western technological neoliberal civilization, it doesn't work to make people happy. It's been quite striking in the last generation. There have been several really important books by not only psychologists, sociologists, even economists, realizing that fact. And so there is, I think, an increasing awareness that our civilization is problematical. An awareness, I think, that's going to be aggravated as as ecological disasters continue to happen. In other words, we're already seeing this, and as we all know, they're just going to get worse. And the kind of transformation of consciousness that's going to encourage as people realize, you know, what's coming down, I think that's going to play a big role. But finally, and maybe the most important of all, I think is generational differences, right? I mean, we can see the young people can see they have no future in the kind of world that we are creating and maintaining. And a lot of them see that, and they're angry, they're furious, they're disgusted. They don't identify with this kind of civilization. So if we're looking for the change of consciousness that's necessary and that's widespread, my sense is that may really be where it's most deeply happening. And that does give me hope, whether I should have hope or not.
Yeah, Marco Saida.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone. Wow. Thanks so much to Vandana, to David, to Stephen, to Scott. It's been so inspiring to listen to all of you tonight and to really hear the incredible balance that you all are able to maintain between your own spirituality, your deep spirituality, and at the same time, your social activism and your deep engagement. So thanks so much to all of you for this evening's dialogue, and of course to Scott for moderating so skillfully again.